And now we're joined by Michael Aaron, editor-in-chief of the Esports Bar Association Journal.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Earlier this week, the heads of Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple virtually came together to address Congress in an antitrust hearing. Accusations were lobbed from congresspersons about the predatory practices being used by said companies. Of course, all these companies have some hand in the esports business, from Facebook Gaming, Twitch, YouTube Gaming, and to a lesser extent, the Apple App Store and Apple Arcade. So, Michael, just for listeners that are kind of maybe wrapping their brains around this for the first time, uh, what what's the purpose of these antitrust hearings, and where does this history come from?
So that's a great question actually, because the antitrust laws can be fairly complex and are pretty difficult to understand. But in essence, antitrust laws just seek to promote competition in the United States markets. And this comes in the form of three main ways of regulation. Section 1 of the Sherman Act prohibits every contract, combination, or conspiracy and restraint of trade, and courts have interpreted this to prohibit unreasonable restraints on trade. So, when you think about the classic cases of price fixing, that is, one person telling a competitor to have the same price, that's exactly what we're getting at with a contract, combination, conspiracy, and restraint of trade. Section 2 looks at monopolization, so these are the big oil barons, railroad barons, and now, today, potentially the tech and information barons. And they say that while possession of a lot of market power might not be bad, and in fact that is something that we heard repeated frequently during the hearings, is that big is not bad, but when it is coupled with anti-competitive conduct, such as predatory pricing and the like, then we began to question that maintenance of monopoly power. And then finally, a big question is mergers and acquisitions, and the antitrust law seeks to prevent those mergers and acquisitions that would lessen competition and increase concentration in a market. And so these hearings looked at the four businesses that you discussed, and the four CEOs were essentially there to answer any and all questions about the accusations against them and their four companies. Congress is just trying to determine, are the antitrust laws that we have today, that were created over 100 years ago, still adequate to protect consumers and their choice over getting the best products for the best price today, when new harms are present and new ways of achieving monopoly are being discovered by these companies?
You know, when listening to these hearings, the thing that kind of struck out at me were some of the practices that these companies were doing. For example, Amazon would get into negotiations to buy a company, then be able to look at its underlying technology, steal that technology, and then integrate it into its own platform, and then never actually buy the company. Or Facebook and Google would essentially strong-arm companies and say, either you let us buy you for a good price, or we'll just copy your technology and run you out of the business. Does this sound to you as, things that could be cross-applied to those antitrust laws that were written 100 years ago?
It depends. This is something what is discussed today as platform capture. Essentially, the operator of a platform, and let's take Amazon as an example because it's a very easy example to understand. Amazon operates as the operator for its market. So if you want to sell on Amazon Marketplace, you have to agree to its terms and conditions and the like. So if I'm an independent seller of, let's say, batteries, and I want to sell a product, I have to agree to certain rules imposed by Amazon. Now the problem is that, let's say we get into a niche category where there's maybe one or two sellers of the product. Amazon, on their end, as the operator of this marketplace, gets data on essentially these let's say, battery sellers. And they're able, using their rules, to determine how they price these batteries, how they sell them, in what quantities, at what time, when are sales being made. And then what Amazon does is actually come out with its own product. Let's say the Amazon brand, its private label batteries, to compete with that person that was selling on their platform. Using their platform power, they make sure that their competitors are actually delisted or not promoted in a way to ensure that people buy Amazon's product over a third party's product. And so platform capture is not new. It is something that has happened for years, but the information age really complicated this because you have companies like Apple and like Amazon who essentially serve as gatekeepers to a market. And that's the real concern that we have, is that these gatekeepers are restricting competition on the very platforms that they compete in.
Yeah. So in essence, what you're saying is that these platforms, their own microeconomies, in which they have total control and then can strong arm any minor threat with precision and ease.
Exactly. And that's one of the big concerns. And how they do it really takes a couple of different forms. We mentioned the Amazon example of simply selling a competing product on the Amazon marketplace and driving the other person out of business. Or in the case of Facebook and the acquisition of Instagram or WhatsApp, simply telling the owner of Instagram, for instance, that we are going to compete with you, and if you don't want to be run into the ground using Facebook's data, using Facebook's market power, just sell to us, and we're going to acquire you, and we're going to prevent competition through acquisition.
Well, then let's try to circle this back into esports. So all of these companies have some kind of influence in this space, whether you have Amazon and Twitch, Facebook and Facebook Gaming, Google with YouTube Gaming, and I guess Apple with its App Store. And you can argue that, many of the top mobile esports exist on its app platform. And if the company continues to do its Apple Arcade, it might develop a competitive title at some point. So if these companies were to be broken up, what would that mean for its respective esports plans?
So I think you need to address each of these companies in turn. Let's also first say that whether or not a company will be broken up is actually a good question. Many of the Congress people during the hearings raised ways of addressing the antitrust problem. Why hasn't the antitrust law been able to cope with these big information tech giants? Some say that it's just a matter of enforcement, and that more cases need to be brought against tech giants like Amazon and Google. On the other hand, sometimes it's a remedy problem. So, do we need to just impose fines like we've been doing? Seeing, actually, Facebook just faced a $5 billion fine by the FTC. Or perhaps we go more behavioral and ask them to change their policies. Or what you were referencing, and that is the structural remedy, is actually gaining a lot of traction in the United States. Although it is seen as a drastic, essential hammer to these companies, it may be appropriate to divide them up and to actually split up the company in a way to make each part of the company competitive without allowing that conglomerate power to be maintained. And so, take for example, you have Amazon, right? And they have their Amazon Marketplace, they have their Amazon Web Services, they have Twitch, and they have all of their independent product lines on the Amazon Marketplace. You might see Congress and the Antitrust Division, or the FTC, asking Amazon to divest itself from certain businesses. So when you start seeing scrutiny of Amazon, you start being concerned that perhaps they'll have to divest Twitch, or they'll have to divest Amazon Web Services. Both of these services are critical infrastructure for esports, because they allow content to reach the end consumer. And in a divestiture, you might be reducing efficiencies achieved by putting those companies together. So Amazon Web Services and Twitch, for instance, or even just the marketplace and Twitch. You're going to see some changes to the company. It's unclear what those changes may be, but it might disrupt a bit of the esports economy.
If, for example, Amazon and Twitch are separated and broken up into separate entities, it seems that, Twitch's underlying kind of mechanisms rely on AWS. Is it even practical to really say that, now these are two separate companies when in reality they rely on each other so much?
I think that's a great question to be asking. And whether or not splitting off a company actually is appropriate, whether or not we want to deprive Amazon of its inherent efficiencies of having AWS and Twitch together. On the one hand, splitting it up will allow competitors to Twitch, like YouTube, or now Facebook Gaming, actually compete without having to create a similar service like AWS, because that would be a barrier of entry, because the efficiencies aren't achievable without that partnership. On the other hand, like I said, there are efficiencies, and it seems to be that they are passed on to the consumer. We're seeing lower and lower prices, and like Twitch, we're seeing no prices at all except for ads. And that is inherently good for the consumer. It gets very, very tricky about when and how to split up a business, because in the end, the antitrust law seeks to promote competition. And if a business is split off in such a way that it no longer becomes effective or profitable, or they have to raise prices, then the antitrust law has failed because the consumers will be paying more for a worse product.
In the case for Twitch and Amazon, at the moment, Twitch is essentially so small in the Amazon ecosystem that it's not even showing up in its quarterly reports yet. Are all these like small esports arms, whether it be Facebook Gaming or Twitch, are they just essentially like too small to be broken up? Or maybe that argument could be said in regards to Facebook and Instagram, where maybe Instagram was like a small and scrappy competitor that Facebook bought early and then blew it up into this massive thing.
The question really is about the future of the company. Because while Twitch might be a small proportion of the revenue generated by Amazon, it is by no means a small company in and of itself. Can it be successful as a standalone company? I think that yes, absolutely. I think it would still be a competitor to YouTube and to Facebook Gaming. But you're right. It might not make sense to split it off because it is just too small. And in fact, during these congressional hearings, we didn't see a lot of attention to Twitch. Amazon's marketplace seemed to be much more of a pressing issue. Similarly, in the questions about Alphabet and Google, YouTube was featured only a couple of times, primarily because Congress was concerned about Google's use of user data and sharing that with YouTube, or between its branches, between its ad branch that allows personalized ads through the Google search services, and YouTube's collection of that data, including from streamers, from content producers, and from children, was a big concern. And it makes more sense when you see a bigger branch of a company like YouTube be separated off from a company like Alphabet that has so many products under its services that it makes sense to hack off YouTube, and with it, its esports arm, essentially.
When will be the next time we'll start hearing more and more about the fate of these companies in regards to this congressional investigation?
So the investigation, this hearing, was essentially a culmination of a year's worth of work. This is the 6th hearing in the series, and after reviewing over 1.3 million documents and having several other discussions with these companies, we're likely to see the recommendation by the Antitrust Subcommittee in a couple of weeks. As I mentioned before, it's very difficult to determine how they will respond to these big tech companies because we heard so many different voices, whether saying that antitrust law is good as is when it comes to more enforcement, or if we need a real revamp of antitrust law to make sure that consumers, viewers of esports, for instance, are protected from these big tech giants.
Well then, in a few weeks, we'd love to have you back on the show.
That sounds wonderful, Ahmad.
And that was FTW with Ahmad Khan. If you like the show, please rate, subscribe, and share. Your support will help the show grow. Check out ftwahmad.com for transcripts and links to our Patreon. If you'd like to follow Tom and his writing, you can find him at Mettiest. That's MATTHIEIST. If you'd like to follow Michael, he can be found at AaronMJ on Twitter. That's ARINMJ. To follow me and my writing over at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere, you can find me on Twitter at Imad. Annie Pei is our producer. Questions about the show can be directed to her at Pei_Annie on Twitter. Joe Domek is our outreach manager, and Ron Lyons is our researcher. With that, we'll catch you guys next week.